Hi everyone, and welcome back to our design system series. Today we're going to be creating our second component, which is an input field. Don't worry if you haven't been following along. There is an exercise file in the description where you have everything you're going to need for this video. There is also a link to sign up to Figma if you've never used it before. Let's jump in. To create our input field today, we're going to go with a 5-step system. We're going to plan it, build it, color it, variable it, and component it. And then in the end, we'll use it in our designs. Let's get started on our first step, planet. In your file, you'll find this table, which is my planet table. You can change it around however you want. This is all that my input field is going to be able to do. It's going to have a few different states. It's going to have an icon on the left and on the right that you can turn on and off. It's going to have a label, some input text, and then a hint at the bottom. That's all you need for Planet, and I really recommend doing this step because it will help you out later in the process. Moving on to step 2, build it. Let's build this input field in the simplest way we can. So really just chucking all the elements on the page. I'm going to start with the label. So clicking on T, tapping in, and I'll just write label. I won't look too much at the sizes of the text for now. I'll do that in one of the later stages. So my label is going to sit kind of above my input text. So I'm going to need it to be in an auto layout. So Shift and A will do that for me. And then I can duplicate this text box, Command D, and I need it to be underneath, so I need to change the layout of this auto layout to vertical, just over here in my arrows. And I'm going to remove the spacing to 0. So I've got a text box underneath a text box with 0 spacing in between. I'll change the text of this one to input text, and then this auto layout should probably be aligned to the left. Great. This is kind of how it's going to look. Obviously with colors and spacing, it will look a lot better. Now I need an icon on the left and an icon on the right. I have my own icon set up in this file because it's my design system, but you can get icons from anywhere. There's a great plugin called Iconify that I really recommend. I'll go into my icons page and I'm going to grab a calendar icon. So I'll just Command C and paste it over here. So that's going to be the icon on the left. And then on the right, I want a close icon. So I'll go into my icons over here and just get a close one, copy it. Perfect. First of all, and most importantly, if you've watched any of my videos, you'll know this. Frames need to be named. So frame 3 means nothing. Let's call it something with some description to it. So I'll call it text. And then I'll put all of this in an auto layout, Shift and A, and I'll call this content. Also want to remove this spacing actually. So I'll remove the H and the V padding from my text auto layout. And then in my content auto layout, I'll just keep the spacing as 28 for me, but that's just because that's how they were placed before. Just leave it at whatever it is. Wonderful. Then my last bit I need is my hint text that's going to go underneath this. Click on T, tap in, hint text. And then all of these should probably be in an auto layout as well. So selecting all of them, Shift A, I'll just make this 0. So the last thing I want to do and build it is I just want to adjust something within this content auto layout. I know that I don't want to do spacing too much right now because later my variables are going to control the spacing, but I do know that this auto layout inside, this text auto layout, should take up the most amount of space. So I'm going to change it to fill container, and then the width of this auto layout should probably be, let's say, 360, and I'll make sure that the content auto layout is set to fill. Just go through that again. My big auto layout is set to 360. Then my content auto layout inside of it, that's all of the top bits, is set to fill. So it takes up as much space as it can. And then the text auto layout inside of it is set to fill as well. So it takes up as much space as it can, pushing out its kind of brothers and sisters to the right and left, while keeping the rule of the auto layout, which is 28 spacing. So if I hover over that, you can see those pink lines. So I've got element, 28 spacing, element that is filling up as much space as it can, 28 gap, and then another element. Now let's go on to the colors. So I will select the content and then I want to fill it with one of my just surface colors. That's how I set up my design tokens, but you can set this up in whatever way you want. I'll probably use subtle. Yeah, that looks really good. Let's change the color of these texts. So my label, I probably want it to be my subtitle text. Yeah, that's great. And then input is going to be my body text. Then my hint, I might just go with caption. Yeah, so again, if you don't have these in your design system, you can just put whatever colors you want that do create that differentiation between them, because colors always help with the hierarchy. On the color it stage, I do want to also set up my text styles. So let's start with input text. That's going to be the biggest one. I'm probably going to use body for this one. Yeah. And then my label can be just like one level down than that. So I have my body set to 16 and then I have a subtitle at 13. That works fine. Then let's look at my hint. Should I use a caption? Footnote? Oh, yes. So my footnotes are set up with all caps, which means that the text is always going to be capitalized. You do that in the advanced settings over here. So I kind of like that. Because I'm planning to have my input field with a few different states, color it is the stage where I'm going to actually create those states. So I'll go into my input field and just duplicate it. So Option and Shift and drag it down. So default is going to look like this. Now let's set up how it's going to look when it's selected. So when it's selected, I think I'm just going to add a stroke. I do have some stroke color set up, and you can see because of color scoping, which is amazing, I was able to hide all the rest of the colors and only show my border colors here. I can show you how to do that later when we create our variables. So for this one, I probably want to add a border, maybe the darker border around it. Yeah, that's great. Let's go into my input field and duplicate it. Now I need my error state. Now, the way I set up my variables originally, if I just go in and show you, I have some semantic colors over here, and I really recommend you have this in any design library. I'll link the video where we did this, but just briefly going through it. In my semantic colors, I have primary, error, warning, and success. And for these, I just have some basic colors set up, some surface colors, some border colors, and some text colors, and I'm going to use those now. So because this one is set up as the error state, I'm going to change the fill color to my surface semantic color subtle and my stroke to my semantic color border darker. And I'm going to also change the text. So instead of the label being text style over here, text subtitle, I'm going to change it to this label from my semantic colors. This will all make sense in a second. I'm going to also change my hint to the label in the semantic colors. Now, if you remember how this was set up, and if you don't have this set up this way, that's also fine. You can just choose these colors normally. Because I set it up as different modes, what I can do is click on my input field. In this button, I can change the variable mode to error, and boom, everything changed to the error colors. So if we look again at our variables, if I chose the subtle surface, it was on primary before, but then I changed it to error and it just became red because it chose a different mode. I'm going to do the same with my success. So I'm just going to duplicate this, and instead of error, I'll choose success. And just like that, I've got two of those states just there. So we've colored all of our input fields. Let's move on to our next and best step, which is variable it. So in the file, you have this table which is kind of guiding us through which variables we want to create for our input field. So let's make those now. So I'll go into my local variables. Now, if you have been following along in the buttons video, we did create a components token collection when we created some variables for our button. But these tokens or variables did have 3 modes. They had a small, medium, and large, and we don't need modes now because input fields are usually the same size, so we're not doing that. If you want to have 3 sizes for them, feel free to keep using this collection. So I'll change the name of this collection to component tokens SML, just so I know that these ones are with small, medium, and large. And then I'll add a new collection. I like numbering them, so 05, and I'll call it component tokens. So I'll create my first variable in here. It's going to be a number variable, and I'll call it input field / radius, and that creates that input field group for us where all the variables that have to do with input field are going to be underneath that title. Our first variable is radius, so that's already there. Now for radius, because I set up my system with some radius tokens in the back, I'm going to call those. So basically I have some sizing tokens for radius that I use across all of my design system because I didn't want to just be able to use any radius I want. I wanted to narrow it down. And I also have in my primitives, I do have a scale of 2s. So just kind of, so 2 till 40 and then 99 for a full. And I will be calling out to these rather than actually typing the numbers. So if I go into my component tokens again, input field radius, and then I'm gonna call an alias medium radius token. Again, you could just type in 8 if you want. Create a variable, new one, spacing. For this one, I'll call my 8 primitive, then h padding. Now, the reason it's better to call out to primitive rather than type in a number is right now I'm using 2 scales, but what if my design, for whatever reason, needs to move to use 3 scales? So instead of 2, 4, 6, it's 3, 6, 9. I can just change it in my primitives, and then it will trickle down to everything that's been using it, rather than me having to go one by one and changing it there. Oh, I need a 6 here. Then icon size is 24, so number, icon size, and 24. The next thing I need to do is to assign these variables, but before I do that, I'm gonna do one of my favorites, which is scoping. So I mentioned this in the colors before, but scoping basically means that I don't want these variables to be shown everywhere. I want to be able to manage where I can see them. So for example, radius, I'll go into here. I don't want to see this as width and height. It's not width and height, it's a radius. So I can turn off everything and just tick corner radius. Spacing, that isn't everywhere, it's just an auto layout thing, so that's called gap. Same with H and V, so I can select both of them holding down shift, right click, edit variables, and only have the gap. And then icon size, this one is just a width and a height. So let's assign them now. I can select all at the same time. So I'm going to select my content auto layout. So I'm not selecting the big auto layout, I'm selecting the thing inside of it, the one that holds the icon and the text and all of that. And let's do the radius first. And you can see when I click here, I can only see the different radius variables. I don't see just everything and everything. So I'm looking for O5 component tokens, input field radius. Lovely. Now let's do H padding and V padding. So in my H padding, I'm just going to look for input, and you can see the H padding, then here, input, V padding. So for spacing, when I hover over, let's say padding or radius or anything like that, the variable button just appears. But in spacing, you have to click on this drop down and then select it. So apply variable and then input. There we go, spacing. Lovely. Now I'm actually going to use this spacing for one more thing. So if I just select everything like that, I can see that I'm selecting kind of the big auto layout, the input field auto layout, and the spacing between the content and the hint is now 0, but I do want to give it some breathing room. So I'm going to add that in this spacing as well. That looks great. So now that we have our input field looking pretty and all variabled up, we're going into our last stage, which is componented. Now this is where this table really comes in handy, because we've got so much going on in this input field. So I'm going to select all of my input fields together and go into my drop down next to the component button and say create component set. So now we have this set, we need to start creating the different variants to differentiate between them, right? So when we click on our component set, we already have one property over here, and let's just rename it to state. So I'll double click on it and type in state. Now we can go through the different ones and change the value. So the first one, the value is default, that's fine. The second one is selected, so we can just replace the text over here, error, and success. Now let's look at our next thing, which is the icon. For the icon, we're going to create a component property. So I'm selecting my input field. I go into my properties, click on plus, and add a Boolean component property. I'm going to call it icon, and I think the default value is true. Yeah. So I've got this little error because I'm not actually using it. So I need to connect this to something on the page. So I'll select my icons over here. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm just holding down shift. And then in the layers section of the design panel, I've got the component property button here, and I can just apply this Boolean property to them. So you see now they're connected to icon. I'm actually going to pull out one of these. So I'm selecting it, holding down option and shift, and just dragging it out. So this is an instance of my component. I just want you to see it happening kind of live. So when I turn the icon on and off, you see that the text is just kind of moving to the left to fill up that space. And I can change between the different states. So I see that I've set up another component property that I want to do, which is an instance swap. Because my icons are connected to a component, then I can do this. I'm going to do this the other way. So you can set up a component property and then assign it, or you can set it up on the element itself. So I'm going to select all my icons again, holding down shift And then in the section of the design panel where you can change it to a different instance of a different component, I have this component properties button, and I can create an instance swap property. Now I can't have two properties named the same because I already named the previous one icon. I need to name this one something else. So what I like to do is add a little pencil emoji because I'm like editing it. So if I click on Control, Command and Space, I get the emojis over here, and I'll put in a little pencil. And actually, I've got two icons, don't I? I've got one on the left and one on the right. So I'm going to add an arrow as well. I'm going to use one of those like triangle-y brackets that goes left and then a dash, and that turns it into a arrow and right icon. Now this is the preferred values section. If you want, you can, it's kind of like scoping. You can say, I don't want the user to be able to select any icon they want. I want to add some icons for them. So you can see I've got all my icons here, and I can say they can only choose a cloud or a calendar, for example. But for me, I want to give them free reign to do whatever they want. So I'm actually not gonna use a preferred value. I'll create the property. I'll go back into my input field, just double click on this and add the arrow onto there as well. So I can see it here. I can turn the icon on and off, and I can change it to a different icon if I want. Now let's look at the next one, which is label. So for label, I want to create a text component property. So I will select all of my labels. In the design panel, there is a section here, kind of where you change the font or select a font style. There is this open text box over here, and I have this create text property button. So I'll click on that and I'll call it label. Now that means if I click on my instance, that now I have the ability to change what it says from the design panel, and I don't have to double click into it. Change that back to label. The next one is the input text. So let's do that. I'm going to select all of my input texts. I'm just holding down Command and Shift to do multiple selection and that deep selection, so I don't have to double click in. So I've selected all of them. Then I want a Boolean property. So Boolean component properties are created from the layers section. I'll click on this one, and then I need to create a new property. I'll call it input text. Now that means if I go into my instance up here, I can turn off the input text if I want. Now I see something is happening that I don't really like. What's happening is that everything is shrinking and it becomes quite small, and I don't love it. That's why it's great to have an instance while you're doing this, just to see what happens. In order to fix that, I'm actually going to select all of my content auto layouts, and I'm going to add a minimum height to it. I don't want to choose a fixed height, because if I choose the fixed height and I say, let's say 56, which is what it's on now, if the text grows and I want it to wrap underneath, the text box will stay small, right? And the text will just keep growing, and I don't want that. So I'm just going to add a minimum height instead. So in order to do that, I know this looks disabled, but there's still a drop down here, and I'm going to add a min height. I'm going to say 56 is actually the minimum height. And that means if I look at my instance now, if I turn off the input text, it stays 56, but it can grow however much it wants to grow, right? So if this text keeps growing, you see the input field does grow, and that's kind of what I want to happen. Obviously not to this extent, but I'd much rather have that than it just being a fixed size that then can't grow. So minimum height to the rescue. We've created our input text Boolean. Now let's create a text property for our input text. So I'll select all of my input text. You can see my Boolean property connected. Now let's connect the text property from here, create property. I'll add a little emoji again, Control, Command, Space, input text. So now I can change the text from here as well. And because this text box also has a Boolean, when I turn it off, you see that the other component property to edit the text is gone because it's not there anymore. Now the next one is the right icon. So I'm going to select all of my X's, just holding down Shift. And then on the layers panel, I will create a property for this icon. So dash, and then the brackety thing going to the right icon. So that means if I look over here, I can turn this icon on and off. And then I also want an instance swap for that one too. So selecting all of my X's. Then in this section, I will just click on the component property button and create this. So I need the arrow, then my pencil, then icon, and remember to remove the preferred values from here. So let's have a look. Great, I can change it to whatever I want. And the last one is the hint. So I need a Boolean and I need a text. So I'll select all of my hint text and I'll add a Boolean from the layers section. We know this, we're experts. Create property, hint, and also in the content section, I'll add Control Command Space from the pencil and then hint. So if we look at our instance, I can turn the hint text on and off, and because it's in an auto layout, then the height will just shrink down if the hint text isn't there. So now we have this really useful component for ourselves to use that is so versatile. I can keep it, you know, without the label and maybe without some hint. I can have it just like this in my design, for example. Then if I want to add an icon, I want to change it to an error, I want to change the label to password, change the cross to an I, and then in the input text, I just want to put, yeah, and then maybe actually remove this icon. Yeah, so it's so versatile. I can do so much with this. And that is that. In a really short amount of time, we've built this amazing versatile component together. In the next session, we're going to look at more form elements. We're going to build a radio button and a checkbox and make them really fancy with labels and hints and all of that. And of course, we'll use lots and lots of variables. I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe and leave a comment below. Let me know how you're getting on. See you at the next one.